got the opportunity here to sit down with Dr. John Holcomb, and he's going to kind of explain to us the importance of hemorrhage control in the pre-hospital setting. So welcome, Dr. Holcomb. Maybe you can tell us just a little bit about yourself real quick.
So Andy, thanks for having me here. It's great. I am a general surgeon. I was in the Army for a long time, had the opportunity to deploy with Special Operations Forces for almost a decade. And then I've been in the civilian trauma community for the last decade.
Awesome. So why do you think Stop the Bleed is important for the bystander?
You know, it's this stopping bleeding concept is actually incredibly important. When you look at what causes folks to die both in the military and the civilian world, it's bleeding. And the sooner you stop bleeding, the better the patients do. And so getting everybody involved in this concept is extraordinarily important.
Okay. So how have you engaged here in Houston with your community? And it's a very large city, obviously. So how have you made an impact?
Well, in 2008, when I got out of the Army, we put tourniquets in our emergency department within about 2 weeks of my arrival. Another couple of weeks, we had tourniquets on the helicopter, which serves 7 million people. We then put thousands of tourniquets on every ambulance in the greater Houston area. And then we bought 10,000 tourniquets and put 2 of them on every police officer in the greater Houston area. Those are all happening over time. And then actually last year, we put 35 tourniquets on my little village's police officers. It's interesting, and people go, well, did that make a difference? Within 2 weeks of putting tourniquets on our little village in Bel Air, Texas, a police officer put a tourniquet on an upper extremity and a civilian who was bleeding to death from a car crash.
So, which leads to kind of the next question. You know, what kind of barriers have you had by getting it out into with the police, EMS, and even the bystander?
So I think it's been interesting over the last decade, right? So in the military, we were pretty well convinced in about 2002, 3, and 4 timeframe that tourniquets made a difference, and we had to roll that out in the military. And as you know, many people involved with that. But by about 2005 and 6 in the military, everybody was convinced, and the soldiers were convinced because they were carrying it right next to their ammunition. You then transition to the civilian world, and it's been kind of the same thing. It hasn't happened overnight. But over the last decade, since I've been a civilian, you go from it was unusual and abnormal to have a civilian come in with a tourniquet placed pre-hospital. And now today, a decade later, it is unusual and abnormal not to have a tourniquet on an extremity. In fact, it's reportable back to that medic or back to that police officer about why they didn't place a tourniquet, because they all have them.
Interesting. So here's kind of a concept that's been floating around. If you could only teach one part of bleeding control or stop the bleed, what would it be? So direct pressure, wound packing, or tourniquet application?
Well, as a contrarian, I'm not going to accept that question. And the reason is because there's 2 types of bleeding, right? There's the bleeding that as a surgeon, I kind of call it irritating. It's irritating. There's bleeding, but it's not fatal. And that is the vast majority of bleeding. And that is the bleeding that you can control with pressure and gauze dressing. But then there's the fatal bleeding that pressure and gauze dressing doesn't work well for, and that requires a tourniquet. And so I would ask your question, you're asking a question about 1, I'm going to give you an answer that's 2. If it's bad, then you need a tourniquet, and you need it first. I would not do pressure on that one. Right? But the majority of bleeding can be taken care of by pressure and gauze.
Okay. So it's just vital that they understand what is life-threatening hemorrhage and what needs a tourniquet versus I can control this with direct pressure.
And when we did the Stop the Bleed program with Surf Like That, we spent a lot of time on that concept, and the Stop the Bleed program kind of wants you to understand, granted it is sometimes difficult to tell the difference between irritating, oozing, and life-threatening bleeding. I would always err on the side of putting a tourniquet on so that you'll have tourniquets put on in patients who, when they arrive in the hospital, when they're up on the gurney and have all the lights, and we sort it all out. In hindsight, didn't have life-threatening bleeding, but it's better to over-triage than under-triage. If we under-triage and don't put tourniquets on patients who needed them, we know from the military data, and we know from civilian data that we've published out of our hospital, that patients will die unnecessarily.
So you've kind of been on the forefront of the whole Stop the Bleed campaign. how did you get involved? Were you asked to kind of participate in this, kind of push it out, or did you take it upon yourself to really kind of get involved?
Well, the Stop the Bleed campaign has been a real merging of military and civilian folks. And so I was invited as a civilian, but with past military experience, to be part of the Stop the Bleed program almost from its inception. It's been a wonderful opportunity to interact with national leaders at the national scene and with local leaders in Houston and, as I said, in my little village of Bel Air.
So we know most businesses and public buildings, we all see that they have AEDs out there, but not really don't have the kits available that we'd like to see. So what can be done, you think, to kind of promote the importance of putting these hemorrhage control kits in public places?
So it's interesting as you go through airports, which a lot of us do, they're starting to pop up more and more and more, and you'll see bleeding control kits right next to AEDs. I think this is, frankly, industry can get involved with this as well. There's a PR campaign to educate folks. I mean, most people know about stop, drop, and roll for burns. They know about CPR for cardiac arrest patients. And what I like about this campaign and what I've, in my 30-some-odd-year career in medicine, I've never seen medics, police, local civilians, and the medical community come together like over this issue. It's coming together and it's happening actually very quickly.
Yes, I would agree. That's what seems to be somewhat of a slow process is actually very quickly being adapted across medicine. So what do you think community leaders can do to kind of help promote Stop the Bleed?
So I think it's incumbent upon the medical community, both pre-hospital and hospital, to educate our community leaders, the mayors, the chiefs of police, the medical directors of all EMS agencies, and go to those community meetings that we all have and offer the opportunity to educate. Almost everybody has said yes when we begin that, to show how easy it is to put on a tourniquet, and then tell the stories, just like we did with a police officer who saved a life 2 weeks after they started carrying tourniquets.
So we know the local EMS and law enforcement play a huge role in Stop the Bleed. What should local EMS and law enforcement do to promote it? Is it? I know you kind of mentioned it, but is there more than that the pre-hospital professionals can really do? Should they be interacting with the elected officials and such?
Absolutely. There's no question about this with the local EMS and law enforcement. There are frontline folks in a lot of respects. We've taken this lesson from the military. We started out with tourniquets in the hospital, in the combat support hospitals and forward surgery teams, and that made a difference. But then we moved the tourniquets to the medics, and that made a difference. But it really made a difference when it was on every combatant on the battlefield: Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine, Special Operations, every combatant. And then in a lot of respects, we're going the same way in the civilian world. Start in the hospital, then the helicopters, then the ground ambulances. Police officers now in most places in the country are carrying tourniquets, if not bought by the mayor, but also self-funded by the police officers. And, if you talk to civilians, non-medical, non-police, there are a lot of tourniquets out on being carried in cars and just by civilians. So it's happening, I think. And then promoting the successful uses of tourniquets by all those folks is going to be very important to spread.
What about primary care providers? Do you think they can play a part in this by providing information to their patients that they see and kind of just providing the education? Hey, here's where you go. I don't necessarily see it, have seen it in the past where they say, hey, go out and learn CPR or something like this, but could it be a potential opportunity to kind of educate their patients?
I think the primary care folks that are in the medical world are the front line, just like with stopping smoking, right? Exercise, eat right. Part of this is stopping bleeding. Stop the Bleed says it all. Pressure, tourniquets, and education. I will say that my kids are a little bit different because they obviously live with a trauma surgeon, but my children know how to put tourniquets on, and we put tourniquets in both of their high schools. For the same reason we put it in our police officers, and then did education along with it.
Awesome. So what's the future of Stop the Bleed?
So I think the Stop the Bleed is on a roll. It's like this huge snowball that's becoming a huge, it's got a lot of momentum. It's gathering speed. It's getting bigger. It's spread outside the United States and around the world, as you all know. I can envision where every vehicle will have a Stop the Bleed kit in it. My 3 cars all have Stop the Bleed kits in them. And, it's just going to get bigger and bigger and bigger, and we're going to save more lives. It's a good thing.
Yeah. So we hear all sorts of anecdotes about people using tourniquets, bystanders using tourniquets. Is there any real data out there to show that it's saving lives right now in the civilian world?
So I think the bystander data, the non-medical data, is a little bit hard to get hold of because, of course, the bystanders don't put data into a registry of any kind. We kind of live and die by data, and we just published in the Journal of Trauma a paper that covers our 8-year experience with tourniquet use. And much like the data out of Ibn Sina in Iraq, where pre-hospital tourniquet versus in-hospital in the military saved lives, what we showed pretty conclusively is that pre-hospital tourniquet use in Houston saved lives compared to putting in the tourniquets on in the hospital. So I think the data and the case reports are going to make a big difference for some of the folks that are a little bit more reluctant to jump on this thing.
So leading into that, is there some myths and issues that we have to overcome to get it out there, get more tourniquets, more Stop the Bleed efforts, more hemostatic dressings?
I think that in the old days, which was 10 to 15 years ago, that the thought was if you put a tourniquet on, that equaled amputation. A lot of people were taught that. I certainly was taught that in medical school. Now what we know is that that's not true. Actually, you save lives, you decrease blood loss. Amputations that occur in extremity trauma have probably already essentially occurred already, and you just finished the amputation, so it's not contribute to amputations at all. So like any long-standing tradition in medicine, it takes about a decade or so to undo that. There's been so much data coming out of the war in Iraq and Afghanistan and others, and now data coming out of the civilian world, that I think that the naysayers have become very quiet lately.
So that's what you got to do. You got to provide the evidence to these naysayers, and hopefully they'll understand what evidence-based medicine is and how to incorporate this life-saving technique.
And I think the reason is because the group that got together recognized the power of that tradition and then what it takes to overcome tradition. There's been a lot of focus on training and education. This is not just providing a tourniquet and walking away. You provide education and tourniquets. You go back and talk to the folks afterwards, just like any other intervention. This is like pre-hospital blood products and pre-hospital airway management. Pre-hospital hemorrhage control evolves over time, and we all want to get better for our patients. And I think the data is suggesting that our patients are doing better by putting tourniquets on earlier.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Dr. Holcomb. Any last closing comments or thoughts you have?
So it's a great opportunity to talk to you guys. I really appreciate it. Couldn't be a stronger supporter of the National Stop the Bleed program.
Awesome. Thank you, sir.